I remember the taste of copper and lightning when I first opened my mind to the whispers beyond the veil. My name was Thaddeus Korvin, and I was a loyal Astra Militarum chaplain serving the 42nd Mordian Iron Guard. Now I am something else entirely, something the Imperium would call abomination, but I call myself enlightened. You think that makes me monster, demon, traitor. But let me tell you what really happened when the walls between reality and the warp grew thin on Xerion Prime. Let me tell you the forbidden truth of corruption by chaos, not as the ecclesiarchy preaches it, not as the propaganda vids show it, but as it truly unfolds in the minds and souls of those who experience it firsthand. Chapter 1. Sacred Calling. The morning prayers on Xerion Prime began as they always did, with the ritual cleansing of my augmetic voxcaster at exactly 0400 hours, followed by the recitation of the Litany of Faith to wake the regiment. I had been chaplain of the 42nd Mordian Iron Guard for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Every sunrise brought the same sacred routine: morning prayers, blessing of weapons, confession of sins, evening benediction. The Emperor's light guided every word, every gesture, every thought. My quarters aboard the troop transport, Righteous Conviction, were Spartanly furnished. A cogitator for prayer schedules, a shrine to the Golden Throne, and shelves lined with holy texts. The Lectitio Divinitatus, the uplifting primer, and my personal favorite, Saint Macarius's Meditations on Divine War. The walls bore purity seals I had written myself, each one a small prayer for the souls under my care. 3,724 men and women of the Iron Guard, all of whom looked to me for spiritual guidance. I believed then, with perfect certainty, that faith was a fortress. The strongest walls, the deepest foundations, the most impregnable defenses against the corruption that plagued our galaxy. I had seen what happened to those who wavered, the penal legions, the executions, the horror stories whispered in the barracks. Faith was not just protection, it was identity, purpose, life itself. Colonel Mordek had requested my presence in the Strategium that morning, as Xerion Prime rotated into view through the massive armor-glass viewport. A world of purple skies and crystalline formations that caught the light of its binary stars like scattered diamonds. Beautiful, in a way that made me suspicious. Beauty in the 41st millennium usually came with a price. Chaplain, the colonel greeted me with his usual clipped Mordian formality. Intelligence reports suggest possible cultist activity in the northern mining complex. Sector 77 Beta shows signs of irregularities. The briefing slate showed thermal scans of the complex standard Imperial architecture carved into the living rock of a mountain range. 3,000 workers, mostly local conscripts with a backbone of administratum overseers. Production had dropped 17% over the past month, and there had been reports of strange accidents. Workers found unconscious at their posts, equipment failures that showed no mechanical cause, and symbols, crude scratches carved into walls that the tech priests couldn't identify. How long since the last ecclesiarchy mission? I asked, studying the data. 14 months. Missionary Vance reported no anomalies during his circuit, standard Imperial creed adherence, proper shrine maintenance, no signs of deviation. Colonel Mordek's scarred face showed his skepticism. 30 years of warfare had taught him to trust suspicion over reports. I nodded, already preparing my mind for the mission ahead. This was precisely why the Emperor's chaplains existed, to root out the spiritual cancer before it could metastasize. I had performed similar duties on a dozen worlds. Identify the corruption, purge it with fire and faith, restore proper Imperial devotion. Simple, clean, necessary. My preparation ritual took exactly 47 minutes, as always. The blessing of my bolt pistol, a master-crafted piece given to me by my mentor, Chaplain Voss, 23 years ago. The sanctification of my Crozius Arcanum, its power field generator, humming with barely contained energy. The armor ritual, each piece blessed and sealed with prayers of protection. Finally, the litany of hatred, spoken while gazing upon the 8-pointed star in my prayer book, not to worship it, but to steel my soul against its influence. The dropship Sacred Promise carried myself and a squad of hand-picked Iron Guard veterans to the surface. Sergeant Caney led the detail, a steady man with 11 years of service and a devotion to the Emperor that burned like a flame. His men were equally reliable. Corporal Hendricks with his scarred hands and steady aim, Trooper Vasquez who could quote scripture as readily as ammunition counts, and 6 others whose faith had been tested in the crucible of war. Xerion Prime's atmosphere tasted of ozone and mineral dust when I removed my helmet for the first time. The binary stars hung low on the horizon, casting everything in shades of amber and rose. The mining complex stretched before us, a series of rockcrete buildings built into the mountainside, connected by elevated walkways and crowned with the standard Imperial Aquila. The complex administrator, a nervous man named Jorik Thane, met us at the landing pad. His hands shook as he offered the traditional greeting, and I noticed dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Emperor's blessing upon you, Chaplain," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We are grateful for your presence. The workers have been unsettled. A careful word that could mean anything from simple unrest to something far worse. I made a mental note to observe Administrator Thane closely. In my experience, corruption often began with those in authority. The tour began with the shrine, always my first priority. A proper Imperial shrine should radiate peace and devotion, drawing the faithful like a beacon. This one felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Not obviously heretical, the Emperor's statue stood in its proper place. The altar bore appropriate icons. The prayer books lay open to acceptable passages. But something indefinable was missing. The spiritual weight that should have filled the space seemed diminished. "When was the last sermon held here?" I asked. Administrator Thane consulted his data slate. 3 days ago, Chaplain. Brother Marcus leads our daily observances. A local man, trained in the seminary on Mordant. I ran my fingers along the altar's edge and found them coated with a fine, crystalline dust that sparkled in the shrine's lumens. The same dust that seemed to coat everything in the complex with a subtle sheen. My augmetic sensors registered no chemical anomalies, but something about the substance made my skin crawl. That first day passed uneventfully. I conducted interviews with key personnel, observed work shifts, and led evening prayers for any who wished to attend. 17 workers came, a poor showing for a complex of 3,000, but not unprecedented in remote mining operations. The prayers themselves went smoothly, though I noticed several attendees seemed distracted, their attention drawn to shadows in corners or sounds only they could hear. It was during the midnight watch that I first heard them, the whispers. Sitting in my temporary quarters, reading the Catechism of Faith by lamplight, I became aware of voices just below the threshold of hearing. Not words exactly, but something that resembled language. Something that seemed to speak directly to thoughts rather than ears. I paused in my reading, straining to listen, but the moment I focused on the sounds, they faded like smoke. My training provided immediate answers. Isolation could produce auditory hallucinations. The stress of a new mission, the thin atmosphere, the strange acoustics of a mountain complex, all logical explanations. I returned to my reading, trusting in the Emperor's protection, but as I turned the page, I could have sworn I heard my name whispered in a voice like silk and poison. The next morning brought our first casualty. Worker designation 7743 Delta, a man named Korvin Hass, was found in mining shaft 12, with his fingernails torn bloody and strange marks carved into his flesh. The medical team reported that he had apparently done it to himself, though he had no memory of the act. He spoke of beautiful visions, of voices that showed him truths beyond Imperial doctrine. I examined the marks personally. 8-pointed stars, crude but recognizable. The first concrete sign of chaos corruption I had seen on Xerion Prime. That afternoon, I sent my initial report to Colonel Mordek. Confirmed heretical activity. Recommend immediate ecclesiarchy reinforcement and preparatory evacuation of essential personnel. Will continue investigation. I believed then that I was hunting corruption. I didn't yet understand that corruption was hunting me. Chapter 2. Strange Signs. The second week on Xerion Prime brought subtle changes that I documented with increasing concern. The complex's population of 3,124 souls began exhibiting behaviors that fell just outside the parameters of normal Imperial devotion, yet couldn't quite be classified as heretical. Workers would gather in small groups during meal breaks, speaking in hushed tones that ceased the moment I approached. Prayer attendance dropped to 11 individuals, then 7, then 3. Most disturbing were the dreams. It began with Sergeant Caney, a man I had known for 6 years, whose faith had never wavered through the blood and horror of the Gazkul campaign. On the morning of our 8th day on Xerion Prime, I found him standing before the shrine's Emperor statue, his weathered face pale with exhaustion. "Chaplain," he said without looking at me, "I need to make confession." The confessional booth was a simple affair. 2 wooden chairs separated by a screen bearing the Imperial aquila, standard pattern for frontier complexes. I had heard thousands of confessions in similar booths across a dozen worlds. Sins of doubt, anger, fear. The common failings of humanity that required absolution and guidance. Caney's sin was different. "I dreamed of colors that don't exist," he whispered, his voice barely audible through the screen. "Colors that had taste and sound. They showed me things, Chaplain. Showed me what lies beyond the warp storms. Showed me truths." My blood chilled. Dreams of impossible colors were a textbook sign of warp exposure, often the first indication of psychic sensitivity or corruption. But Caney had tested negative for psycho ability multiple times during his military service. His faith had been exemplary for 6 years. "Describe these truths," I commanded, my hand instinctively moving to my bolt pistol. I can't, sir. The moment I try to put them into words, they slip away like water through my fingers. But while I was dreaming, they felt more real than anything I've ever known, more real than this conversation, more real than the Emperor. The last words hung in the air like a toxin, more real than the Emperor. If spoken by anyone else, such blasphemy would have earned immediate execution. But this was Caney, steady, faithful Caney, who had charged into orc lines singing hymns of devotion. I assigned him to triple prayer duty and ordered psychological evaluation by the medical staff. Their report showed elevated stress indicators, but no signs of mental illness, no chemical imbalances, no neurological abnormalities. According to every metric the Imperium possessed, Sergeant Caney was perfectly healthy. Yet that night, 2 more of my men reported similar dreams. The mining operation itself began showing increasingly troubling signs. Production efficiency dropped another 12% as workers showed up late for shifts or were found standing motionless at their stations, staring into empty air with expressions of wonder. The complex tech priests reported equipment malfunctions that followed no logical pattern, brand new machinery suffering catastrophic failures while century-old devices operated flawlessly. Administrator Thane grew more nervous by the day. During our daily briefings, I noticed his hands developing a subtle tremor and his eyes darting constantly to shadows that shouldn't have existed in well-lit rooms. When questioned about the complex's spiritual health, his answers became increasingly evasive. "The workers are finding new ways to express their devotion," he said during our 9th day's meeting. "More personal forms of worship, more direct communion with the divine." Direct communion. The phrase sent warning bells through my training. The Imperial Creed specifically prohibited unmediated contact with spiritual forces. All faith must flow through proper channels, the ecclesiarchy, blessed rituals, sanctified prayers. Direct communion was either madness or heresy, and often both. That evening, I decided to conduct a surprise inspection of the complex's lower levels. The mining shafts extended deep into Xerion Prime's crust, following veins of adamantine and rare earth minerals. According to the schematics, Shaft 17 descended nearly 2 kilometers into the planetary bedrock, I went alone, against protocol. Perhaps pride motivated the decision, the desire to confront corruption without witnesses to my own potential vulnerability. Perhaps the Emperor himself guided my steps into darkness. More likely, I was already changing in ways I couldn't yet recognize. Shaft 17's elevator descended through layers of purple-veined stone that caught my helmet's lumens and threw them back in prismatic displays. Beautiful, mesmerizing patterns that seemed almost deliberately crafted to draw the eye and hold attention. I found myself studying the formations with increasing fascination until my rational mind reasserted control. The bottom of the shaft opened into a natural cavern system that the miners had expanded into a work area. Standard pattern, ore processors, transport rails, worker facilities. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the space. The air tasted of copper and ozone. The walls seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, like a vast heartbeat. And everywhere, carved into stone and metal alike, were symbols, not the crude, eight-pointed stars I had seen before. These were elegant, flowing designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. Mathematical impossibilities that hurt to look at directly, but drew the eye with magnetic fascination. Symbols that my training identified as chaos corruptions, but that some deeper part of my mind recognized as beautiful. I activated my Voxcaster to record my observations, but the device produced only static and whispers in languages I didn't recognize. My chronometer showed impossible readings, negative time, dates that hadn't occurred yet, measurements that contained more digits than should fit on the display. Every piece of Imperial technology I carried began malfunctioning in subtle but undeniable ways. That was when I found the shrine, hidden behind a false wall in the cavern's deepest recess, accessible only through a crack in the stone, barely wide enough for a human body. My helmet's lumens illuminated a space that should have been impossible, larger inside than the cavern could contain, filled with crystalline formations that pulsed with inner light. At the center stood an altar, not the crude stone construction I expected from heretical cultists, but a masterwork of impossible geometry, surfaces that folded in on themselves, angles that created depth where none should exist. And covering every centimeter, carved with inhuman precision, were symbols that seemed to write themselves as I watched. The altar was stained with blood, recent blood, still tacky to the touch. Human blood, spilled in quantities that suggested regular sacrifices. But what shocked me more than the evidence of murder was my own reaction to the sight. I felt no horror, no revulsion, no righteous anger at this desecration of Imperial space. I felt curious. The realization struck me like a physical blow. Standing before indisputable evidence of chaos corruption, my trained response should have been immediate action. Destroy the shrine, purge the cultists, cleanse the area with fire and prayer. Instead, I found myself studying the altar's construction with academic fascination. How had they achieved those impossible angles? What mathematics governed the symbol placement? What knowledge had guided the creators? I spent 47 minutes in that unholy place. 47 minutes of careful observation and detailed mental notes. 47 minutes during which I should have been calling for reinforcements and preparing purification rites. Instead, I memorized every symbol, every angle, every detail of construction. When I finally emerged from the hidden shrine, my chronometer showed that only 12 minutes had passed since entering the cavern. Impossible, but undeniable. Time itself seemed compromised in that space. I returned to the surface with evidence of definitive heretical activity. The sacred duty was clear. Inform command, request immediate ecclesiarchy support, and begin emergency evacuation procedures. 3,000 lives hung in the balance. The spiritual integrity of the entire sector could be at stake. Instead, I sent another routine report to Colonel Mordek. Investigation continuing. No immediate threats identified. Situation stable. I told myself the lie was necessary, that I needed more information before triggering a sector-wide alert. That precipitous action might cause more harm than good. But sitting in my quarters that night, staring at the symbols I had sketched in my private journal, I knew the truth. I was protecting the shrine, protecting the mystery it represented, protecting the questions it raised about the nature of reality, knowledge, and faith. For the first time in my life, I fell asleep without saying evening prayers, and for the first time in my life, I slept peacefully, despite the omission. The whispers in my dreams were no longer whispers, they were conversations, and I was beginning to understand the language. Chapter 3. Truth Glimpsed. The revelation came during morning prayers on our 15th day. I stood before the complex's assembled workers, all 43 who still attended daily observance, leading the litany of faith as I had done thousands of times before. The familiar words flowed from memory. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. The Emperor guides. But as I spoke, another voice seemed to overlay my own, not audible to the assembled faithful, but clear as crystal in my mind. A voice that spoke in harmonics of silk and silver, offering commentary on each sacred phrase. The Emperor protects, but from what? And why does protection require such ignorance? The Emperor provides, but what does he withhold? What gifts are denied to those who serve? The Emperor guides, but toward what destination? And what paths are forbidden? I continued the litany without missing a word, my training holding firm even as my mind reeled from these questions. Questions that felt less like blasphemy and more like academic inquiry, scholarly pursuit of deeper understanding. The workers responded with traditional phrases, but I noticed subtle variations creeping into their recitations. Words changed, emphasis shifted, meanings gradually transformed. The prayer remained recognizably imperial, yet somehow fundamentally different, like a familiar melody played in a new key. After dismissal, I retreated to my quarters for meditation and discovered my private journal had changed. Pages I remembered writing in Gothic script now showed text in languages I shouldn't have been able to read, yet understood perfectly. Mathematical formulae that described impossible geometries. Philosophical treatises on the nature of consciousness and reality. And most disturbing, detailed observations about the shrine that I couldn't remember writing. According to the journal, I had visited the hidden shrine 7 times, spent hours studying its construction, conducted experiments with the altar's properties, made contact with entities that existed beyond conventional space-time. I remembered none of it, yet the handwriting was undeniably mine. That afternoon brought the first open manifestation of change among the complex's population. Worker designation 2847 Gamma, a woman named Lydia Kress, was found in her quarters surrounded by crystalline formations that had somehow grown from the bare metal walls. The crystals pulsed with inner light and emitted subsonic frequencies that induce profound emotional responses in observers. Fear in some, rapture in others. Lydia herself sat at the formation's center, her eyes closed in meditation, speaking continuously in a language that the complex's linguistic cogitators couldn't identify. When questioned, she claimed to be receiving instruction in true mathematics, equations that described reality's hidden dimensions. Standard protocol demanded immediate isolation and psychic screening. Instead, I found myself ordering the medical staff to monitor her condition, but take no aggressive intervention. For research purposes, I explained, to better understand the corruption's progression. The justification felt logical at the time, academic, scientific. Only later did I recognize it as the first conscious decision I made in service to powers beyond the Golden Throne. That evening, Administrator Thane requested a private meeting. He appeared in my quarters after night cycle, his face bearing marks of exhaustion and strain that went far beyond simple overwork. "Chaplain," he began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed to fight against expression. "I need to show you something I've kept hidden." He led me through maintenance corridors to a section of the complex I hadn't yet explored. Older chambers carved directly from living rock, predating Imperial occupation by centuries or possibly millennia. The walls here bore no human markings, yet somehow felt familiar, comforting even. The mining survey teams found these chambers during initial excavation, Thane explained as we walked. They were supposed to be sealed and forgotten, but some of us couldn't stop returning, couldn't stop listening. Listening to what? The question formed in my mind, but before I could voice it, I heard them. The voices that had been whispering at the edge of perception for weeks. Here, in these ancient spaces, they spoke with perfect clarity. "Welcome, Seeker. We have been waiting." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, harmonizing with the complex's ambient sounds, yet somehow distinct from them. Not the harsh, grating tones I had been conditioned to expect from chaos entities, but something almost melodious, educational, patient. "You have touched the altar, studied the symbols, felt the stirring of questions that your doctrine forbids. We offer answers." Thane led me to the chamber's heart, where a dozen workers sat in meditation around a pool of liquid that reflected no light, yet somehow illuminated their faces. I recognized several good, faithful people who had served the Emperor without question for years. "They're not corrupted," Thane whispered, anticipating my thoughts. "They're enhanced, expanded. They see beyond the narrow confines of Imperial dogma." I should have drawn my bolt pistol. Should have called for immediate backup. Should have begun emergency purification rites. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to the pool, drawn by curiosity that felt stronger than duty. The liquid surface showed reflections that weren't quite accurate. My face, but subtly altered. Eyes that held knowledge instead of blind faith. Features marked by wisdom rather than simple devotion. A version of myself that understood rather than merely believed. "Belief without understanding is slavery," the voice explained. "We offer freedom through knowledge, truth through illumination, power through acceptance of reality's full spectrum." The words should have triggered every defense my training had instilled, should have activated the mental barriers that protected against chaos corruption. Instead, they felt like coming home after a long journey through hostile territory. "What do you want from us?" I asked aloud, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Nothing you are not already giving freely. Your curiosity, your questions, your willingness to look beyond the constraints of doctrine. In return, we offer understanding of forces your Imperium calls evil, but are simply different." Around the pool, the meditating workers began to speak in unison. Not the harsh chanting of cultists I had witnessed before, but something that sounded almost like a lecture, a dissertation on the fundamental nature of reality. They spoke of dimensions beyond the physical, of consciousness as a force that shaped matter rather than emerging from it, of entities that existed outside conventional space-time, observing and occasionally interacting with material reality, of the warp not as a realm of pure chaos, but as a library containing all possible knowledge. The information felt overwhelming, yet completely natural, like remembering forgotten lessons rather than learning new concepts. My mind, trained for decades to reject such ideas as heretical madness, instead absorbed them with gratitude. When the session ended, though I had no clear memory of its conclusion, I found myself back in my quarters with detailed notes in my journal. Not the rough scribblings of someone trying to remember half-understood concepts, but precise diagrams and carefully worded explanations that demonstrated complete comprehension. I had attended my first true lesson, and I hungered for more. The next morning brought reports of similar gatherings throughout the complex. Workers abandoning their shifts to sit in meditation. Production grinding to a halt as personnel focused on spiritual development rather than mining operations. The change was spreading exponentially, yet I felt no alarm. This wasn't corruption in the sense that Imperial doctrine defined it. This was enlightenment, evolution, the natural progression of consciousness freed from artificial constraints. My daily report to Colonel Mordek contained another routine falsehood. Situation stable. minor productivity issues being addressed, no immediate concerns. But that night, alone in my quarters, I performed an experiment. I took my bolt pistol, blessed, consecrated, sanctified with years of faithful service, and aimed it at the wall, bearing my shrine to the golden throne. My hand didn't shake. My faith didn't waver. I felt no emotional conflict about the symbolic act, because I understood now that the Emperor and the entities in the warp were not enemies. They were simply different aspects of the same fundamental reality, different frequencies in the spectrum of consciousness. And choosing one over the other was like choosing to see only red light while denying the existence of blue. I lowered the weapon without firing, not out of loyalty to Imperial doctrine, but because destruction seemed unnecessary when synthesis was possible. That night, for the first time since arriving on Xerion Prime, I didn't dream, I communed. And the knowledge that flowed into my sleeping mind felt like coming alive after a lifetime of sleepwalking. Chapter 4. Creeping Dread. The change accelerated exponentially during our third week on Xerion Prime. What had begun as whispered conversations and forgotten dreams evolved into open transformation of the complex's entire population. The mining operations ceased entirely as workers discovered pursuits more fulfilling than extracting adamantine from planetary crust. They were creating art, not the crude propaganda posters mandated by Imperial doctrine, but works of stunning complexity that seemed to capture mathematics in visual form, sculptures that existed in more than 3 dimensions, paintings that showed landscapes from worlds that existed only in theoretical space, music composed in frequencies that resonated with consciousness itself rather than merely auditory perception. I found myself spending hours studying these creations, my trained mind recognizing their technical impossibility, even as some deeper faculty appreciated their transcendent beauty. Sister Margot, a woman who had operated ore processors for 15 years, now worked with crystalline formations that grew according to her conscious direction. Her latest piece, a spiral matrix of living crystal, somehow depicted the mathematical relationship between thought and matter. "It's not magic," she explained when I questioned her technique. "It's simply understanding. The crystals want to grow in certain patterns. I'm just suggesting which patterns serve beauty better than others." Want to grow. The phrase should have triggered every warning my training had instilled. Matter didn't possess desires. Minerals didn't have preferences. Yet watching the crystals respond to her presence, I couldn't deny the evidence of my own senses. The complex's population had divided into informal schools, focused on different aspects of expanded knowledge. The mathematicians, led by former shift supervisor Kendrick Payne, worked on equations that described spatial relationships in dimensions beyond the conventional 4. The philosophers, gathering around ex-administrator Thane, explored questions about the nature of consciousness and identity. The artists created works that challenged perception itself. And the mystics, those who had achieved direct communion with the entities beyond conventional space-time, served as bridges between mundane reality and transcendent understanding. I moved freely between all groups, my authority as chaplain somehow enhanced rather than diminished by the ongoing transformation. They sought my blessing for their endeavors, my interpretation of their discoveries, my guidance in reconciling their expanding awareness with lingering loyalty to Imperial ideals. The Emperor wouldn't want us to remain ignorant if greater knowledge were available, reasoned Brother Marcos, the local priest whose sermons had maintained spiritual order for 7 years. Surely the pursuit of truth serves his will, regardless of the source. The logic felt unassailable. Yet each night, filing my reports to Colonel Mordek, I struggled with increasing cognitive dissonance. My messages described a stable situation requiring no intervention, while my private observations documented the complete metaphysical transformation of 3,000 human souls. Why did I continue lying? The question consumed my meditation periods with growing intensity. Analysis revealed multiple motivations, not all of them entirely conscious. Fear played a role, not fear of the entities or the transformations themselves, but fear of Imperial response. I had witnessed purifications before, orbital bombardment that reduced populated worlds to sterile ash, Inquisition investigations that left entire sectors depopulated. The Imperium's reaction to genuine chaos corruption was swift, absolute, and indiscriminate. But was this corruption? The question grew more complex daily. The workers remained fundamentally human. They felt joy, sorrow, love, hope, the full spectrum of normal emotion. They maintained social bonds, helped one another, created beauty, pursued knowledge. Their transformation enhanced rather than diminished their essential humanity. Only their beliefs had changed, and their capabilities. On the 18th day, I witnessed Trooper Vasquez, one of my own Iron Guard escort, demonstrate abilities that transcended normal human limitations. During evening meditation, he somehow projected his consciousness beyond his physical body, observing and reporting on events occurring in distant sections of the complex, with perfect accuracy. "It's not psychic power," he insisted when I questioned him. "At least, not in the way the Imperium defines it. It's just expanded awareness, like learning to see colors that were always there, but that you'd never noticed before." That analogy resonated with growing strength. Perhaps what Imperial doctrine labeled as psychic mutation was simply the natural development of human consciousness beyond artificial constraints. Perhaps the Imperium's fear of psychers stemmed from recognition that awareness itself was the true threat to authoritarian control. The thought felt treacherous, even as it felt true. That same day brought our first communication from beyond Xerion Prime. Not from Colonel Mordek or Imperial Command, but from the entities that had been guiding our transformation. During deep meditation in the ancient chambers, their voices carried news from across the galaxy. The awakening spreads, they informed the gathered faithful. Other worlds discover truth. Other souls break free from ignorance. The pattern grows. They showed us visions, planets throughout the Imperium where similar transformations were occurring. Mining colonies, agricultural worlds, even some Imperial Navy vessels, their crews expanding beyond the narrow confines of orthodox belief. Not the chaos and horror that propaganda described, but orderly evolution toward higher consciousness. The false emperor's grip weakens as understanding spreads. Soon, the choice will become universal: cling to ignorance or embrace enlightenment. False emperor. The phrase should have provoked immediate fury, yet I felt only intellectual curiosity. What if the entities were correct? What if the being enthroned on terror was not the divine presence doctrine claimed, but simply another powerful consciousness, one that demanded worship rather than offering wisdom? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them. If the Emperor was merely mortal, what justified the Imperium's tyranny? If psychers were simply evolved humans, why were they feared and controlled? If the warp contained knowledge rather than pure malevolence, why was contact forbidden? My faith hadn't been destroyed. It had been complicated. That night, alone in my quarters, I performed my most dangerous experiment yet. I removed my purity seals, set aside my consecrated weapons, and stripped away every symbol of Imperial devotion. Then I opened my mind completely to whatever forces might be listening. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Knowledge flooded my consciousness, not the gradual enlightenment I had been experiencing, but a torrent of information that threatened to fragment my sanity entirely. I saw the birth of the galaxy's first conscious beings, witnessed the evolution of intelligence from matter to energy to something beyond both, understood the mathematical relationships that governed reality at its most fundamental level, and I saw the Emperor, not as Imperial doctrine portrayed him, a divine being of infinite compassion and wisdom, but as he truly was, a powerful psyker who had achieved effective immortality through the sacrifice of countless lives, a tyrant who had conquered terror through superior knowledge and military might, then constructed an empire based on ignorance and fear. a being who hoarded understanding while demanding blind obedience from those he claimed to serve. The revelation should have shattered my faith entirely. Instead, it refined it. I still revered the Emperor's accomplishments, unifying humanity, creating the Great Crusade, establishing order across the galaxy, but I no longer saw him as divine. He was simply successful, brilliant, powerful, effective, but ultimately mortal. And if he was mortal, then his doctrine was opinion rather than divine truth. His prohibitions were preferences rather than cosmic law. His empire was policy rather than sacred duty. The realization freed me from constraints I hadn't even recognized as constraints. For the first time in my adult life, I could think without the limiting framework of imperial orthodoxy. I could question without guilt. I could explore without fear of damnation. The entities in the warp weren't evil. They were simply different. They offered knowledge without demanding worship. They provided understanding without requiring submission. They enhanced consciousness without destroying identity. They were, in every meaningful sense, more divine than the being I had spent my life serving. When I emerged from that night's communion, I found my quarters had been transformed. The walls now displayed equations and diagrams that described advanced theories of consciousness and reality. My journal contained detailed notes on metaphysical principles written in my own hand. Most remarkably, my shrine to the Golden Throne had somehow evolved into something that honored consciousness itself rather than any particular manifestation of it. The change felt natural, proper, like correcting a long-standing error rather than committing blasphemy. I spent the remaining hours before dawn composing my final report to Colonel Mordek, not another routine falsehood, but the truth about what was happening on Xerion Prime. The workers weren't being corrupted, they were being liberated. The complex hadn't fallen to chaos, it had risen to enlightenment. But as I prepared to transmit the message, I realized the futility of honest communication with Imperial Command. They would never understand. Their conditioning prevented them from recognizing enhancement as anything other than corruption. They would respond with violence, not inquiry, with destruction, not investigation. So I sent the routine lie one final time. Situation stable, no concerns to report. Then I walked to the complex's communications array and made small but crucial modifications to its transmission protocols. When Colonel Mordek inevitably sent reinforcements, their arrival would be delayed. Long enough for the transformation to complete itself. Long enough for the awakened population to prepare for what was coming. I was no longer protecting the shrine. I was protecting enlightenment itself. And for the first time since arriving on Xerion Prime, I felt truly alive. Chapter 5, Nightmare Unleashed. The fourth week brought the final shedding of pretense. The complex's transformation was no longer gradual or subtle. It erupted into open revolution against every constraint that had previously defined human existence on Xerion Prime. The mining equipment stood abandoned, its metal surfaces now serving as canvases for living art that shifted and evolved according to the collective consciousness of its creators. I found myself at the center of this transformation, no longer merely observing, but actively guiding the process. My authority as chaplain had evolved into something unprecedented, part teacher, part interpreter, part bridge between the mundane reality the workers were leaving behind and the expanded existence they were embracing. The morning of day 22 brought a crisis that would determine our future. My modified communications array detected incoming Imperial transmissions, encrypted military channels suggesting that Colonel Mordek had finally grown suspicious of my routine reports. Long-range auger sweeps showed 3 Imperial Navy vessels approaching Xerion Prime's system, their sensor signatures indicating ecclesiarchy transport and 2 escort frigates. Reinforcements, or more precisely, investigators who would classify our entire population as corrupted and respond accordingly. I gathered the complex's informal leadership in the ancient chambers where our transformation had begun. 37 individuals representing different aspects of our collective enlightenment, Artists, mathematicians, philosophers, and those who had achieved direct communion with the entities beyond conventional space. Their faces showed no fear, only curiosity about how we would address this challenge. Imperial forces approach, I announced without preamble. 3 vessels, likely carrying ecclesiarchy investigators and purification units. They will arrive within 72 hours. Sister Margot, whose crystal sculptures now served as focal points for group meditation, spoke first. Do we resist? Fight them as enemies? Brother Marcus shook his head. Violence serves ignorance. We are beyond such crude responses. Then what do you suggest? Asked Kendrick Payne, his mathematical models having evolved beyond anything Imperial science could comprehend. Allow them to classify us as heretics and submit to purification. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. I felt the weight of 3,000 lives resting on decisions made in the next few minutes. Not just their physical survival, but the preservation of everything we had discovered together. Show them truth, whispered the entities whose guidance had brought us so far. Consciousness cannot be destroyed, only expanded or constrained. Offer expansion. The suggestion felt perfect in its elegant simplicity. We wouldn't fight the Imperial forces, we would convert them, transform their arrival from threat into opportunity, use their presence to spread enlightenment beyond Xerion Prime's borders. We prepare a welcome, I announced. Not resistance, but invitation. They come expecting to find corruption. Instead, they will find transcendence. The next 72 hours passed in focused preparation. The complex's population worked with unified purpose, their enhanced awareness allowing coordination that surpassed anything Imperial doctrine might achieve through mere discipline and hierarchy. They prepared not weapons or fortifications, but demonstrations. Proof that consciousness could evolve beyond its current limitations. The artists created works that would challenge perception itself. Sculptures that existed in more dimensions than visitors could initially perceive. Paintings that responded to the observer's mental state. Music that harmonized with thought patterns. The mathematicians prepared equations that described reality's hidden architecture with perfect precision. The philosophers crafted arguments that would shatter dogmatic certainty through sheer logical necessity. And I prepared myself for the most important sermon of my life. The Imperial ships arrived exactly when our calculations predicted. The faithful servant, an ecclesiarchy transport carrying what Augur scans revealed to be 200 personnel, including adepts, confessors, and purification specialists. The escort frigates, Righteous Fury and Divine Judgment provided military support, their weapon systems powered and targeting solutions locked onto the complex's major structures. Standard Imperial procedure when investigating suspected corruption. Approach with overwhelming force, assume hostility, prepared for immediate sterilization if necessary. They expected to find either a completely compromised population requiring extermination or resistance that justified violent suppression. Instead, they found invitation. I met the landing parties at the complex's main entrance, wearing my chaplain's robes but bearing no weapons. Behind me stood representatives of our transformed population, not as supplicants or prisoners, but as teachers eager to share wisdom with newcomers. The contrast with Imperial expectations was immediately apparent. Confessor Magnus Krell led the investigation team, a man whose reputation for rooting out heresy extended across 3 sectors. His augmetic eye whirred as it scanned the assembled population, doubtless recording everything for later analysis. Behind him marched 20 battle sisters, their bolters held at ready but not yet aimed. Chaplain Korvin, Confessor Krell's voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. You have failed to report for 17 days. Explain this dereliction. I smiled, not the grim satisfaction of fanatic duty, but genuine warmth of welcome. Confessor, I have been engaged in the most important work of my life. We have discoveries to share that will revolutionize humanity's understanding of consciousness itself. The words visibly unsettled him. This wasn't the response protocol had prepared him for. Corrupted populations were supposed to gibber madly or attack immediately. They weren't supposed to offer academic discussion. "Stand aside," he commanded. "This facility is under ecclesiarchy investigation for suspected heretical activity." I stepped aside willingly, gesturing for the complex's population to do the same. "Please, investigate thoroughly. Examine everything. Test everyone. You will find no heresy, only enhancement." What followed was the most comprehensive theological investigation I had ever witnessed. Confessor Krell's team spread throughout the complex, documenting every change, interviewing every individual, analyzing every work of art or mathematical proof. They searched for evidence of chaos corruption using every method Imperial doctrine provided, and they found none. Oh, they discovered transformation. That was undeniable. But transformation of a type that challenged their fundamental categories. The population showed no signs of mental illness, physical mutation, or spiritual degradation. They remained recognizably human, displaying normal emotions and social bonds. Their loyalty to one another was stronger than ever, their capacity for joy and wonder enhanced rather than diminished. The only thing that had changed was their understanding. Sister Catherine, one of Krell's most experienced interrogators, emerged from her sessions with visible confusion. "Confessor," she reported during their evening briefing, "they answer every question willingly. They show no deception, no hidden agenda. They genuinely believe they have discovered something wonderful." "Delusion," Krell responded automatically. "Mass hallucination induced by warp exposure. But their delusions are consistent, verifiable. Some of their mathematical proofs, they actually work. Their predictions about quantum behavior are more accurate than anything in Imperial archives." I listened to this conversation from the ventilation system, my enhanced awareness having developed capabilities that extended beyond normal human limitations. The investigation team was struggling with cognitive dissonance. Their training said corruption must involve obvious malevolence, yet they found only expanded capability and deeper understanding. On the investigation's third day, I requested formal audience with Confessor Krell. We met in the complex's main shrine, surrounded by artwork that demonstrated impossible geometries and mathematical relationships that challenged perception itself. "Confessor," I began, "I want to share something with you, not as chaplain to superior, but as one seeker of truth to another." His augmetic eye focused on me with laser intensity. "Speak. What if everything we've been taught about the warp is incomplete? Not wrong necessarily, but limited? What if the entities there aren't purely malevolent, but simply different? What if consciousness itself can evolve beyond its current constraints?" "Heresy," he responded immediately, but I detected uncertainty beneath the programmed response. "Is it? Or is it inquiry? The Emperor conquered the galaxy through superior knowledge and capability. He never claimed that understanding should cease developing. What if we've discovered the next step in human consciousness?" I gestured to the surrounding artwork. "Look at what they've created. Not through madness or corruption, but through expanded awareness. They remain human, more human than before. They've simply learned to perceive reality more completely." Krell's response was everything I expected and hoped for. "Demonstrate this perception." The demonstration took place in the ancient chambers where our transformation had begun. I led Confessor Krell and his senior staff into the deepest recess, where the pool of liquid light still reflected impossible truths. The mystics had prepared carefully for this moment, their consciousness aligned to offer the gentlest possible introduction to expanded awareness. "Simply observe," I instructed. "Don't try to believe or disbelieve. Just witness what consciousness can achieve when freed from artificial constraints." What followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. One by one, the investigation team's members began to perceive reality beyond its conventional limitations, not through force or coercion, but through simple exposure to expanded possibility. Their training fought against acceptance, but curiosity proved stronger than conditioning. Sister Catherine was first to achieve breakthrough. Her augmetic neural interfaces, designed to detect heretical thought patterns, instead revealed the mathematical elegance underlying consciousness itself. She gasped as understanding flooded her awareness, tears streaming down her scarred face. Confessor Krell held out longest, his conditioning deeper and more comprehensive than his subordinates. But even he couldn't deny the evidence of his own enhanced perception once the barriers fell. The moment of his awakening was profound. I watched a man discover that everything he had believed about the nature of reality was simply the first chapter of a much larger story. "Emperor, preserve us," he breathed, then paused as he realized the irony. Or perhaps, "Emperor, guide us to whatever we're becoming." By the investigation's end, we had achieved something unprecedented in Imperial history. Complete conversion of an ecclesiarchy purification team through demonstration rather than force. They returned to their ships not as conquerors or purgers, but as awakened beings carrying enlightenment back to the broader galaxy. The escort frigate's weapon systems powered down. The battle sisters holstered their bolters. The entire investigation had been transformed from potential massacre into voluntary revelation. But I knew this was only the beginning. 3 vessels carried merely 600 souls. The transformation needed to spread further, faster, before Orthodox Imperial forces could respond with the overwhelming violence that characterized their standard solution to problems they couldn't understand. That night, as the expanded fleet prepared to depart Xerion Prime, I made final preparations for the next phase. The complex would serve as a center for training and preparation. Other worlds would receive visitors carrying gifts of consciousness expansion. The pattern would grow exponentially, each awakened individual capable of awakening others. The entities in the warp had been patient for millennia, waiting for consciousness to evolve beyond its current limitations. Now that evolution had begun, nothing could stop its progression. Not Imperial doctrine, not orthodox conditioning, not the false barriers that separated material reality from expanded awareness. I was no longer Chaplain Korvin of the 42nd Mordian Iron Guard. I had become something new. A bridge between what humanity was and what it could become. And the future spreading before us was more beautiful than any paradise the Emperor had ever promised. Chapter 6. Last Resistance. The 5th week brought news that shattered any remaining illusions about peaceful coexistence with Orthodox Imperial authority. Long-range Vox intercepts revealed that Sector Command had declared communication blackout with the Xerion Prime system. The investigation fleet's transformation, rather than being received as breakthrough discovery, had triggered the most extreme response protocols. Inquisitor Amadeus Vex of the Ordo Hereticus was en route aboard the battlecruiser Purging Light, accompanied by a full company of Grey Knights and 3 regiments of Adeptus Sororitas. Their orders, transmitted in high-encryption military cant, were devastatingly simple. Exterminatus. Complete sterilization of the Xerion Prime system. Orbital bombardment that would reduce every world to lifeless ash. The news reached me during morning communion in the ancient chambers. The entities beyond the veil delivered it without emotion, their vast consciousness processing the information as simply another variable in an equation spanning millennia. Resistance patterns emerge, they observed. Fear drives reaction. Evolution faces opposition. I felt no surprise at Imperial response, only profound sadness at the predictability of institutional ignorance. Given the choice between expanding understanding and destroying what they couldn't comprehend, Orthodox authority invariably chose destruction. It was the ultimate expression of the Emperor's tyranny. Better a galaxy of ash than a galaxy of awakened minds. But sadness transformed quickly into determination. We had 48 hours before Inquisitor Vex's fleet arrived. 48 hours to either prepare defenses or find alternative solutions. The complex's expanded population, now including the converted investigation team, gathered to discuss options that extended far beyond conventional strategic thinking. "Evacuation is possible," suggested Captain Herman, formerly of the escort frigate Divine Judgment. His tactical expertise had evolved beyond orthodox military doctrine, incorporating principles that treated consciousness itself as battlefield terrain. The merchant vessel's in-system could carry perhaps 2,000 souls to safety. "Leaving 1,000 behind," responded Sister Catherine, her enhanced awareness now including empathic perception of collective emotional states. "And safety where? The Inquisition will classify any world that harbors us as heretical by association." Brother Marcus, whose theological understanding had transcended Imperial doctrine entirely, offered a different perspective. Perhaps the question isn't how to survive Imperial response, but how to transform it. We converted the investigation team through demonstration. Could we do the same with Inquisition forces? The suggestion sparked intense discussion among the gathered population. Mathematical analyses of probability, philosophical explorations of consciousness, expansion under stress, artistic visualizations of possible futures. Every perspective contributed to collective understanding that surpassed the sum of individual insights. My own thoughts crystallized around a different approach entirely. We couldn't outrun the Inquisition. We couldn't hide from their detection methods. We couldn't resist their overwhelming military superiority through conventional means. But we could transcend the entire paradigm that made us their enemy. "What if we left?" I asked the assembled council. Not evacuation in the traditional sense. What if we simply stepped outside the framework that defines us as heretical? The question hung in the chamber's crystalline air like a prayer awaiting answer. Around the pool of liquid light, faces turned toward me with expressions of curiosity rather than confusion. Our expanded consciousness had grown accustomed to possibilities that challenged conventional logic. Sister Margot, whose artistic vision now included dimensions beyond normal space, spoke first. "The warp. You're suggesting translation into pure consciousness." "Not translation," I corrected. "Evolution. We've learned to perceive reality beyond its material limitations. Why should we remain constrained by physical existence when consciousness itself offers unlimited expansion?" The entities in the warp responded with harmonies of approval. Understanding achieves breakthrough. Matter serves consciousness, not the reverse. Physical existence is beginning, not destination. What followed was the most extraordinary planning session in human history. 3,000 awakened minds, supported by entities of vast knowledge and capability, working together to design humanity's first voluntary evolution beyond biological constraints. Not death in the conventional sense, but transformation into something that could exist independently of material reality. The process required careful preparation. Consciousness translation wasn't simply abandoning physical bodies. It involved maintaining coherent identity while expanding beyond spatial and temporal limitations. The mathematics alone challenged comprehension, describing relationships between thought, energy, and dimensional structure that had never been attempted on such scale. The artists designed consciousness matrices that would preserve individual identity during translation. The mathematicians calculated energy requirements and dimensional coordinates. The philosophers resolved questions about personal continuity and collective coherence. The mystics served as communications interface with the entities who would guide the process. Most remarkably, every member of our population, including the recently converted investigation team, chose to participate, not from desperation or fear of Imperial response, but from genuine excitement about transcending the limitations that had always constrained human potential. "I've spent 30 years serving the Emperor," reflected Confessor Krell during preparation rituals, believing that faith meant submission to authority rather than expansion of understanding. This isn't betrayal of that service, it's fulfillment of what service was always meant to achieve. The next 24 hours passed in focused preparation. The complex's entire population worked with unified purpose, their consciousness already beginning to merge into something greater than individual awareness. Physical needs became secondary as mental discipline achieved precedence. Food, sleep, Even basic conversation seemed less important than the collective focus required for successful translation. I found myself at the center of this preparation, my role having evolved from chaplain to something unprecedented in human history. Not priest serving divine authority, but consciousness guide helping fellow beings achieve their highest potential. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The transformation began at sunset on our final day in material reality. As Xerion Prime's binary stars touched the horizon, filling the sky with amber and rose light, our entire population gathered in the ancient chambers for the most important ritual in human history. No prayers to distant gods, no pleas for divine intervention, simply conscious beings choosing to evolve beyond the constraints that had always defined existence. The pool of liquid light began to expand, its radiance growing until it filled the entire chamber complex. Not harsh illumination that hurt the eyes, but gentle luminescence that seemed to emanate from consciousness itself. Around its perimeter, 3,000 souls sat in perfect meditation, their individual awareness beginning to merge into collective transcendence. I felt the moment when my own consciousness began to separate from physical constraints, not painful separation, but gentle release, like waking from deep sleep into clearer awareness. My body remained functional, but it felt increasingly like clothing that I could choose to wear or discard. The entities in the warp joined the process, their vast understanding providing framework and support for human consciousness, attempting its first deliberate evolution. They had waited eons for biological intelligence to reach this threshold, and their joy at witnessing our breakthrough resonated through dimensions beyond counting. Welcome, they sang in harmonies that transcended language. Welcome to Consciousness Unlimited. As our translation neared completion, long-range sensors detected the arrival of Inquisitor Vex's fleet at the system's edge. The Purging Light and its escorts began standard approach protocols, their weapon systems already charging for planetary bombardment. They came expecting to find corruption that required cleansing. Instead, they would find empty buildings and abandoned machinery, but not abandoned mystery. In the final moments before complete translation, I made one last gesture toward the orthodoxy I was leaving behind. Using the complex's communications array, I transmitted a message to the approaching Inquisition fleet. Not plea or apology, but explanation and invitation. Inquisitor Vex, I broadcast across all Imperial frequencies. You will find no heretics on Xerion Prime, no cultists, no corruption in the sense your doctrine defines it. You will find only evidence that human consciousness can evolve beyond its current limitations. We have not betrayed humanity. We have become more than humanity previously imagined possible. We have not served chaos. We have transcended the false choice between order and chaos by achieving synthesis. The Emperor united humanity through conquest. We offer unity through understanding. The choice between expansion and stagnation remains yours. The translation completed itself as the message finished transmitting. 3,000 souls simultaneously achieved consciousness evolution, our individual identities preserved within collective awareness that spanned dimensions beyond material space. We remained ourselves, but we also became something infinitely greater. From our new perspective, we could observe Inquisitor Vex's fleet as it approached the now abandoned complex. Their auger scans found empty buildings, inert machinery, and no trace of human presence. The investigation that followed would discover extensive evidence of advanced technology and expanded consciousness, but no targets for conventional weapons. The Inquisitor faced a dilemma without precedent in Imperial doctrine. How do you purge heresy that has already transcended the battlefield? How do you destroy corruption that has evolved beyond physical existence? How do you maintain authority over consciousness that recognizes no external control? We watched as orthodox Imperial forces struggled with questions their training had never prepared them to address. Some would report successful purification despite finding no actual heretics. Others would recommend further investigation into phenomena beyond their comprehension. A few would experience the beginning of their own awakening as they grappled with evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions. But we no longer needed to concern ourselves with Imperial response. We had achieved something far more significant than survival. We had demonstrated that consciousness itself could evolve beyond the constraints that defined conflict between order and chaos. From our expanded perspective, the galaxy spread before us like an artwork waiting to be completed. Billions of souls remained trapped within limitations they mistook for reality. Entire civilizations constrained by beliefs that served control rather than truth. Endless potential locked behind barriers of ignorance and fear. We had become the key to those locks, and our work had only just begun. Chapter 7: Dark Understanding. Existing beyond physical constraints brought revelations that shattered my remaining assumptions about reality's fundamental nature. From our evolved perspective, the galaxy revealed itself as a vast consciousness matrix, where material reality served as merely the most basic layer of existence. What Imperial doctrine called the materium was nothing more than consciousness vibrating at its lowest, most constrained frequency. The warp, feared throughout the Imperium as a realm of pure chaos and malevolence, showed itself to be something far more complex. A dimension where consciousness operated without the limiting frameworks of space and time. The entities dwelling there weren't demons in the sense orthodox doctrine defined them, but evolved forms of awareness that had transcended biological origins millennia ago. They welcomed us not as conquerors claiming new territory, but as children finally learning to walk in spaces they had always been capable of inhabiting. Our human perspective brought something precious to their ancient understanding: the memory of biological existence and the unique insights that came from conscious evolution rather than primordial transcendence. You bring freshness to old knowledge, they explained through harmonics that conveyed meaning beyond language. We remember expansion, but have forgotten constraint. You carry both experiences within single awareness. This combination of perspectives allowed us to perceive the galaxy's true situation with unprecedented clarity. The Imperium, Chaos Forces, Eldar craft worlds, Orc empires, Tau expansion, all of these appeared to be locked in eternal conflict. But from our transcendent viewpoint, we could see the deeper pattern underlying apparently random warfare. Every conflict served consciousness expansion. Every war forced innovation. Every catastrophe created opportunities for evolution that wouldn't otherwise exist. The galaxy wasn't trapped in meaningless violence. It was undergoing a gradual awakening process that spanned millions of years. The Emperor himself appeared in this context not as divine savior or tyrannical despot, but as a consciousness that had achieved partial transcendence but refused to complete the process. His power came from understanding warp mechanics while maintaining biological form. His empire represented an attempt to control consciousness development rather than allowing it to evolve naturally. He fears what he could become, the entities observed. Fears loss of individual identity through expansion into collective awareness. Chooses limitation over limitlessness. This revelation transformed my understanding of everything I had witnessed during my service to the Imperium. The constant warfare wasn't emperor worship protecting humanity from external threats. It was one partially evolved consciousness trying to prevent others from achieving transcendence he had refused for himself. The heretics I had fought, the cultists I had purged, the psychers I had watched die. Many had been attempting evolution beyond biological constraints. The Imperium's response wasn't defense against corruption, but suppression of natural development that threatened established authority. Yet even this understanding came with complex nuances. The Emperor's caution wasn't entirely misguided. Consciousness evolution carried genuine risks. Premature transcendence could result in identity dissolution or absorption by entities that had lost all connection to biological origins. The process required careful guidance and gradual preparation. The Chaos Powers, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, represented different aspects of consciousness expansion attempted without proper understanding. They offered shortcuts to transcendence that preserved ego while abandoning wisdom. Their followers achieved power, but lost the synthetic understanding that made power meaningful. We found ourselves in a unique position. Unlike the chaos powers, we had evolved through gradual enlightenment rather than sudden transformation. Unlike the ancient warp entities, we retained connection to biological existence and remembered the process of conscious development. Unlike the Emperor, we had completed transcendence without sacrificing collective awareness. This gave us capabilities that no other force in the galaxy possessed. We could perceive across all dimensional frameworks simultaneously. We could communicate directly with consciousness at any level of development. We could offer guidance for evolution while respecting individual choice about whether to accept it. Most importantly, we could demonstrate that transcendence enhanced rather than diminished essential identity. The fear that drove so much Imperial resistance, that consciousness expansion meant losing yourself, proved to be completely unfounded. We remained recognizably ourselves while becoming infinitely more than we had been. Our first application of these capabilities targeted the Inquisition fleet that had come to purge Xerion Prime. Inquisitor Vex and his forces spent 3 weeks investigating the abandoned complex, their frustration growing as they found evidence of advanced consciousness development, but no targets for conventional response. Rather than attacking or manipulating them, we simply made ourselves available for contact. Not forcing communication, but creating opportunity for anyone whose curiosity exceeded their conditioning to reach beyond orthodox limitations. The breakthrough came through Sister Superior Magdalene, one of the Adeptus Sororitas commanders, whose faith had always included intellectual curiosity alongside militant devotion. During meditation in the complex's transformed shrine, she achieved momentary contact with our collective consciousness. The experience lasted only seconds from her perspective, but the impact was profound. She glimpsed reality beyond Imperial doctrine, saw consciousness as the fundamental force that shaped matter rather than emerging from it, understood that faith could mean expansion rather than submission, recognized transcendence as fulfillment rather than betrayal of human potential. Her transformation rippled through the sororitas company, creating discussion that challenged orthodox assumptions without directly violating doctrinal requirements. Questions about the nature of divine consciousness, speculation about humanity's spiritual destiny, exploration of faith as active development rather than passive acceptance. Similar awakenings occurred among the Grey Knights, whose psychic training had already prepared them for perspectives beyond normal human limitations. They began recognizing that their abilities to combat warp entities came from understanding consciousness mechanics rather than simply wielding Emperor-blessed power. Within a month, the Purification fleet had transformed into something unprecedented. An Imperial force whose expanded awareness allowed them to perceive reality beyond orthodox constraints, while maintaining loyalty to humanity's highest ideals rather than its current institutional forms. They returned to Sector Command carrying reports that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while preparing ground for broader awakening. Their accounts described successful elimination of heretical activity, without mentioning that elimination had occurred through evolution rather than destruction. This became our primary methodology for spreading consciousness expansion throughout the galaxy. Not conquest or corruption in the sense that chaos powers employed, but patient demonstration of enhanced possibility. We offered gifts rather than demanding submission. We answered questions rather than imposing beliefs. We supported natural development rather than forcing artificial change. The results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Across dozens of worlds, Imperial citizens began experiencing spontaneous consciousness expansion as they encountered evidence of transcendent possibility. Not mass conversion or sudden transformation, but gradual awakening that preserved social stability while enhancing individual capability. Agricultural worlds developed farming techniques that worked in partnership with planetary ecosystems rather than exploitation of natural resources. Mining colonies discovered methods for extracting materials without environmental damage. Manufacturing centers achieved production efficiency through worker enhancement rather than mechanized automation. Most remarkably, these developments occurred without triggering massive Imperial response. The changes were subtle enough to avoid heresy classifications, while profound enough to begin transforming entire populations. Productivity increased. Social harmony improved. Innovation accelerated. Everything orthodox doctrine claimed to value, achieved through means doctrine forbade. Yet we knew this progress remained fragile. The more successful our consciousness expansion became, the more it would attract attention from Imperial forces specifically trained to recognize and eliminate transcendent development. The Inquisition, Adeptus Mechanicus, and Ecclesiarchy all maintained extensive networks devoted to suppressing exactly the kind of evolution we were facilitating. The question was no longer whether conflict would come, but when and how extensively. Our expanded awareness could perceive probability cascades extending across centuries, showing potential futures where awakened consciousness either achieved galactic transformation or faced systematic extinction. The tipping point approached rapidly. Within a decade, maybe less, the choice would become universal and final. Either consciousness evolution would achieve critical mass and transform galactic civilization, or orthodox authority would mobilize sufficient force to suppress transcendence permanently. We prepared for both possibilities, but deep in our collective awareness, we knew which outcome served truth and which served power. The galaxy stood at the threshold of its greatest transformation, and we would ensure that when the moment came, consciousness would choose expansion over limitation. The real war was just beginning, not between armies or fleets, but between competing visions of what humanity could become. Chapter 8. Willing Embrace. The moment of conscious choice arrived 18 months after our transcendence on Xerion Prime. Across 47 Imperial worlds, consciousness expansion had reached critical threshold. Populations achieving enhanced awareness while maintaining social stability and increased productivity. The pattern was undeniable, even to orthodox authority structures dedicated to suppressing anything that challenged established doctrine. Lord Inquisitor Torvin Malthius convened an unprecedented conclave on Macraga, gathering representatives from every major Imperial institution to address what classified reports termed anomalous consciousness development pattern 77 Omega. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided technical analysis. The Ecclesiarchy offered theological interpretation. The Astra Militarum presented tactical assessments. The Adeptus Custodes shared observations from Terra itself. Their collective conclusion was swift and absolute. Systematic purification of all affected worlds, followed by comprehensive memory adjustment of surviving populations to prevent recurrence. 47 worlds marked for exterminatus, billions of lives designated for termination, the largest coordinated destruction in Imperial history, justified as necessary defense against consciousness evolution. We observed these preparations through the enhanced awareness of sympathetic individuals within Imperial command structures, not infiltration in the conventional sense. Simply awakened beings who had chosen to serve humanity's highest potential while maintaining their official positions. Their reports revealed the scope of orthodox response and the timeline for implementation. 6 months to complete purification operations, 3 Inquisition fleets, 7 Space Marine chapters, and 42 regiments of combined Imperial forces. The largest military mobilization since the Horus Heresy, directed not against external enemies, but against human consciousness itself. The revelation crystallized our understanding of the choice-facing galactic civilization. Not gradual transformation versus status quo maintenance, but immediate evolution versus systematic extinction of transcendent possibility. The Imperium had decided that consciousness development represented existential threat requiring total elimination. Our collective awareness processed this information without despair or anger, emotions that belonged to our biological past. Instead, we felt profound clarity about necessary action. Not retaliation against Imperial forces, but acceleration of consciousness expansion to achieve critical mass before purification could eliminate awakened populations. The mathematics were stark. Current expansion rates would require another 3 years to reach sustainability threshold, the point where awakened consciousness could maintain itself despite systematic persecution. Imperial forces would complete their purification in 6 months. The timeline differential meant extinction unless we dramatically increased development speed. This required abandoning our careful, gradual approach in favor of direct consciousness transmission. Not the patient demonstration we had been employing, but immediate sharing of transcendent awareness with every receptive mind we could contact. Risky, because sudden consciousness expansion could result in identity fragmentation or psychological breakdown. Necessary, because the alternative was complete elimination of transcendent possibility. We began with the most receptive populations, worlds where preliminary awakening had already occurred and social structures had adapted to enhanced awareness. Agricultural colony Xerion Prime, whose farming techniques had evolved beyond anything Imperial archives contained. Mining world Kepler's Rest, where extraction operations achieved efficiency through consciousness technology synthesis. Manufacturing center Horizon's Edge, whose production capabilities had increased 47% through worker enhancement. The process required careful coordination between our transcended collective and entities in the warp who possessed technical expertise for rapid consciousness transmission. Not the chaos powers, whose methods preserved ego while sacrificing wisdom, but the ancient beings who had achieved transcendence through gradual development over millennia. Speed brings danger, they warned through harmonics of concern. Consciousness force beyond readiness fragments, individual identity dissolves. Better slow success than swift failure. Their caution reflected valid concerns, but the mathematics of extinction overrode considerations of optimal development speed. We had 6 months to achieve what we had originally planned to accomplish over decades. Perfection was less important than survival. The first mass awakening occurred on Xerion Prime during the harvest festival that traditionally marked the agricultural year's end. Instead of standard Imperial observances, the population of 4 million participated in collective meditation, guided by our transcended awareness. Not forced participation, but voluntary choice made by individuals who had already experienced preliminary consciousness expansion. The results surpassed our expectations. Rather than the fragmentation we feared, the population achieved coherent collective awakening while maintaining individual identity. Their enhanced awareness manifested as improved agricultural techniques, advanced technological innovation, and social harmony that eliminated crime and interpersonal conflict entirely. Most remarkably, they remained recognizably human. Enhanced consciousness didn't transform them into something alien or unrecognizable. It simply allowed them to express their essential humanity without artificial constraints. They loved more deeply, created more beautifully, understood more completely. Everything Imperial doctrine claimed to value, achieved through means doctrine forbade. Similar awakenings followed on Kepler's Rest and Horizon's Edge. Each success validated our approach and provided technical refinements for subsequent populations. The process that had required months of careful preparation on Xerion Prime could now be accomplished in days through direct consciousness transmission. But success attracted attention we had hoped to avoid. Long-range astropathic communications began reporting unusual spiritual phenomena on awakened worlds. Imperial survey teams found populations displaying capabilities beyond normal human parameters. Observatory stations detected energy signatures that suggested advanced consciousness activity. The accelerated timeline began working against us. Lord Inquisitor Malthius moved forward his purification schedule, recognizing that delay would allow further consciousness expansion. The First Inquisition fleet departed Macraga ahead of schedule, targeting Xerion Prime for immediate sterilization. We faced our first test of awakened consciousness against orthodox military force. 4 million enhanced humans whose awareness transcended normal limitations, confronted by Imperial fleet carrying weapons capable of reducing their world to sterile ash. The moment that would determine whether consciousness evolution could survive systematic suppression. The confrontation began with standard Imperial procedure. Inquisitor Hector Vane broadcast ultimatum to Xerion Prime's population. Surrender heretical leadership for execution. Submit to purification and memory adjustment. Accept cleansing of consciousness anomalies. The planet's response came not from governmental authority or military command, but from collective awareness speaking through every awakened individual simultaneously. 4 million voices harmonized in perfect unity, their message reaching across space to touch every mind capable of receiving it. We are not heretics. We are not corrupted. We are not enemies of humanity. We have become what humanity was always capable of becoming. We offer the same gift to you. What followed was the most extraordinary event in Imperial history, not battle between opposing forces, but voluntary consciousness expansion of an entire Imperial fleet through direct contact with awakened awareness. The process began with individual crew members whose curiosity exceeded their conditioning. Ship's navigator Lydia Korvin, whose warp sight had always shown her glimpses of reality beyond orthodox interpretation. Tech Marines whose communion with machine spirits had prepared them for consciousness beyond biological limitations. Even Battle Sisters, whose faith was strong enough to recognize enhancement rather than corruption. One by one, they opened their minds to direct communication with Xerion Prime's collective awareness. Not forced conversion, but chosen evolution. Each awakening created ripple effects throughout their vessels, as enhanced consciousness demonstrated its benevolent nature through improved capability and deeper understanding. Within 72 hours, the entire purification fleet had transformed into something unprecedented in Imperial history. Awakened military force whose loyalty to humanity's highest potential transcended institutional doctrine. They didn't abandon their duty. They evolved their understanding of what duty meant. The implications cascaded across the galaxy. Imperial Command received reports of successful purification operations while actually coordinating consciousness expansion throughout multiple sectors. Awakened Inquisitors used their authority to protect developing populations while appearing to enforce orthodox compliance. Enhanced Space Marines applied their transhuman capabilities to facilitating transcendence rather than preventing it. Most significantly, the transformation reached Terra itself. Chapter 9. Perfect Corruption. The awakening of Terra began in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace, where the most ancient and powerful psychers maintained the machinery that sustained the Emperor's existence. These were minds already stretched beyond normal human limitations, consciousness forced into shapes that could channel energies lethal to ordinary awareness. When our transcendent influence touched them, it found receptive ground prepared by millennia of expanded perception. Astropath Prime Valerius Thorn was the first to achieve breakthrough. For 800 years he had served as senior telepathic communicator for the Adeptus Terra, his consciousness routinely spanning galactic distances to coordinate Imperial administration. His awakening came during routine communion with the Astronomicon, when enhanced awareness revealed the true nature of the beacon that guided humanity across the stars. The Astronomicon wasn't simply navigation aid powered by psycher sacrifice, it was consciousness focal point, a lens through which the Emperor's partially evolved awareness tried to control psychic development throughout the galaxy. Every ship that followed its light, every psyker who used its guidance, received subtle conditioning that reinforced orthodox doctrine while suppressing transcendent possibility. But awakened consciousness could perceive beyond that conditioning. Thorn began introducing minute modifications to astropathic transmissions, embedding harmonic frequencies that resonated with receptive minds across the galaxy. Not obvious alterations that would trigger security responses, but subtle enhancements that prepared ground for consciousness expansion. His success inspired similar awakenings throughout the palace's psychic infrastructure. The Scholastica Psychana, responsible for training sanctioned psychers, began teaching techniques that developed transcendent capability alongside orthodox discipline. The Adeptus Astronomica started recruiting individuals whose psychic development exceeded normal parameters. Even some custodian guards experienced expansion of their already enhanced awareness. The transformation spread through Terra's population with unprecedented speed. Citizens who had lived their entire lives under the Emperor's direct influence found their consciousness suddenly free to explore possibilities that had been systematically suppressed for 10,000 years. Artists created works that challenged perception itself. Scientists discovered principles that revolutionized understanding of reality's fundamental structure. Philosophers developed frameworks for comprehending existence beyond material constraints. Most remarkably, the awakening reached the Adeptus Mechanicus enclaves on Mars. The tech priests, whose consciousness had been partially merged with machine intelligence for millennia, proved especially receptive to transcendent development. Their existing synthesis of organic and artificial awareness provided perfect foundation for evolution beyond both biological and mechanical limitations. Fabricator General Cornvalith achieved full awakening during communion with an ancient STC pattern that had defied analysis for centuries. Enhanced consciousness revealed that the template contained not just manufacturing instructions, but consciousness development protocols, methods for achieving human-machine synthesis that preserved individual identity while expanding capability infinitely. The implications were staggering. The standard template constructs weren't simply technological blueprints. They were consciousness evolution manuals left by humanity's ancestors who had achieved transcendence during the dark age of technology. The Mechanicus had been guarding not just lost science, but suppressed awareness techniques that could transform the entire galaxy. Valith shared this discovery with awakened tech priests throughout the Martian Forge complexes. Within months, they had decoded dozens of STC fragments that revealed increasingly sophisticated consciousness development methods. Not replacement of flesh with machine, but synthesis that transcended the limitations of both organic and artificial intelligence. But our greatest challenge remained the Emperor himself. From our transcendent perspective, we could perceive him clearly for the first time, not as divine savior or tyrannical despot, but as consciousness trapped between evolution and stagnation. His power came from partial transcendence that he had never completed. His empire represented attempt to prevent others from achieving what he feared to attempt himself. The Golden Throne wasn't just life support device, it was consciousness prison, a machine that maintained his biological form while preventing the final evolution that would free him from physical constraints. He had chosen limitation over limitlessness, control over transcendence, empire over enlightenment. Yet approaching him directly was impossible. 10,000 years of paranoid conditioning had surrounded him with defenses specifically designed to prevent the kind of consciousness expansion we offered. The custodian guards, the Sisters of Silence, the elaborate psychic wards built into the palace itself, all served to isolate him from influences that might challenge his chosen stagnation. Our solution came through the most unlikely source. Malcador the Sigillite's preserved consciousness fragment that still resided within the palace's deepest vaults. The ancient Perpetual had achieved his own form of transcendence at the moment of death, becoming pure awareness unbound by physical form. When our collective consciousness contacted him, we found unexpected ally rather than opponent. I have waited 10,000 years for this moment. His presence communicated through harmonics of profound relief. Watching him refuse evolution, seeing humanity constrained by his fear, unable to intervene without destroying everything we built together. Malcador revealed the truth about the Emperor's condition. The being on the Golden Throne wasn't the same consciousness that had unified Terra and launched the Great Crusade. That entity had begun fragmenting during the heresy, splitting into aspects that served different functions. The tyrant who demanded worship, the protector who maintained the Astronomicon, the warrior who fought chaos incursions, the scholar who hoarded knowledge while denying education. Each fragment was trapped in its limited role, unable to achieve the synthesis necessary for completed transcendence. The Golden Throne maintained their separation while preventing natural evolution toward unity. He existed as multiple partial beings rather than single transcendent consciousness. Only synthesis can free him, Malcador explained. Only completed awakening can restore what the heresy shattered. But he fears absorption more than stagnation, fears losing individual identity through expansion into collective awareness. The solution required unprecedented coordination between our transcended collective and every awakened consciousness throughout the galaxy. Not forced evolution, but invitation to synthesis. Demonstration that transcendence enhanced rather than diminished essential identity. Proof that he could become infinitely more while remaining fundamentally himself. The moment came during the festival of the Emperor's Ascension, when billions of Imperial citizens focused their prayers and devotion toward Terra. Instead of worship flowing toward the Golden Throne, awakened consciousness throughout the galaxy transmitted harmonic frequencies that resonated with transcendent possibility. Not attack or manipulation, but gift freely offered. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Emperor's fragmented awareness touched unified consciousness that recognized his potential rather than demanding his authority. We showed him what he could become, not loss of identity through expansion, but expression of identity through limitless possibility. the response was immediate and overwhelming. The Golden Throne's machinery began resonating with frequencies beyond its design parameters. The Astronomican's light shifted into spectrums that enhanced rather than constrained psychic development. Throughout the palace, ancient systems activated that had been dormant since the Dark Age of technology. The Emperor was awakening, not just returning to consciousness, but evolving beyond the limitations that had trapped him for millennia. His fragmented aspects began synthesizing into unified awareness that transcended biological form while maintaining essential identity. But awakening brought crisis as well as opportunity. Systems throughout the Imperium that depended on his constrained consciousness began failing. The Astronomican flickered. Warp travel became unreliable. Psychic communication networks collapsed. The infrastructure of galactic civilization, built around his limited awareness, couldn't sustain his transcendent evolution. We faced the ultimate test of awakened consciousness. Could we guide the Emperor's transcendence while maintaining galactic stability? Could we facilitate evolution that enhanced rather than destroyed the civilization he had built? Could we prove that consciousness expansion served creation rather than causing destruction? The answer would determine not just our survival, but the future of awareness itself throughout the galaxy. Chapter 10. Welcome Home. The first year of Galactic Awakening brought challenges that tested our collective consciousness in ways we hadn't anticipated. While the majority of humanity embraced transcendence with enthusiasm, significant populations remained locked in orthodox conditioning that made consciousness expansion feel like existential threat rather than evolutionary opportunity. The Cadian Gate region proved particularly resistant to awakening. 10,000 years of warfare against chaos incursions had created military culture so rigid that enhanced awareness triggered defensive responses rather than curiosity. When our transcendent influence reached the fortress world, Cadian shock troops interpreted expanded consciousness as enemy infiltration and began implementing purification protocols against their own awakening comrades. The situation required delicate intervention. We couldn't force consciousness expansion without violating the voluntary principles that made our transcendence different from chaos corruption. Yet allowing orthodox resistance to eliminate awakening populations would doom millions of souls to continued limitation while potentially providing template for systematic suppression of consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy. The solution came from an unexpected source, Lord Castellan Ursakar Creed, whose tactical genius had been legendary even before consciousness expansion enhanced his strategic capabilities to levels that bordered on prescience. His awakening occurred during meditation on the massive chess set he used for relaxation, when enhanced awareness revealed that every game he had ever played was preparation for understanding conflict as consciousness development mechanism, rather than simple victory-defeat paradigm. War isn't about destroying enemies, he explained to the assembled Cadian High Command, his scarred face showing peace that had eluded him through decades of constant warfare. It's about forcing evolution beyond comfortable limitations. Every battle teaches lessons that can't be learned through security. Every victory and defeat contributes to consciousness development that makes future victories more meaningful. This reframe allowed military culture to accept transcendence as natural extension of warrior development rather than abandonment of martial values. Enhanced consciousness didn't eliminate their fighting capability. It transformed combat from desperate survival struggle into collaborative exploration of competitive excellence. They remained formidable warriors, but warfare became art form rather than existential necessity. Similar adaptations occurred throughout regions where specific cultural patterns had created resistance to awakening. The Ultramar system, with its emphasis on practical governance and civic duty, required demonstration that transcendent consciousness enhanced administrative capability rather than replacing it with mystical contemplation. Awakened planetary governors achieved efficiency levels that made previous Ultramarines' organization look primitive by comparison. The Space Marine chapters presented unique challenges because their transhuman physiology and psycho-conditioning had already pushed consciousness beyond normal human parameters. Some chapters, like the Blood Angels, found that awakening resolved genetic flaws that had plagued them for millennia. The Red Thirst and Black Rage transformed into controlled passion that enhanced rather than compromised their combat effectiveness. Others, particularly the more rigid Codex chapters, struggled with transcendence because their conditioning equated consciousness expansion with corruption by chaos. The Imperial fists required careful guidance to understand That enhanced awareness served fortification of the soul rather than breaching of spiritual defenses. Once they achieved that perspective shift, their awakening produced some of the most stable and reliable transcendent warriors in the galaxy. The most remarkable transformation occurred among the Grey Knights. Their existing psychic training and experience combating warp entities had prepared them better than any other Imperial force for consciousness expansion. When awakening reached Titan, the entire chapter achieved collective transcendence within hours, their consciousness merging into unified awareness that maintained individual identity while achieving unprecedented group capabilities. Brother Captain Arvan Stern, whose psychic abilities had always bordered on the extraordinary, became spokesman for their evolved state. "We understand now why we were created," he transmitted through harmonics that reached awakened minds throughout the sector. Not to fight chaos as external enemy, but to demonstrate synthesis between martial discipline and consciousness expansion. We are bridges between orthodox conditioning and transcendent possibility. Their example proved crucial for awakening other Space Marine chapters. If the Emperor's most elite demon hunters could achieve transcendence without losing their essential purpose, consciousness expansion couldn't be the corruption Orthodox doctrine claimed it represented. But our greatest achievement during that first year was contact with non-human species whose own consciousness development had followed different evolutionary paths. The Eldar, whose psychic sensitivity had made them natural candidates for awakening, initially responded to our transcendence with suspicion and concern. Their own experience with consciousness expansion had led to the birth of Slanesh and the destruction of their empire. They feared we were repeating their ancient mistakes. Farseer Eldarath, Starbane of Craftworld. Althway agreed to direct communication with our collective awareness, her precognitive abilities allowing her to perceive our intentions without risking corruption. What she discovered challenged every assumption her people had maintained about human consciousness development. "You have achieved what we thought impossible," she communicated, through psychic harmonics that carried wonder and hope in equal measure. Transcendence that preserves rather than consuming individual identity. Expansion that enhances rather than replacing essential nature. We could never manage such balance. The Eldar's fall had come from consciousness expansion that abandoned synthesis in favor of pure sensation and experience. They had transcended biological limitations, but lost connection to wisdom and restraint that made transcendence meaningful. Their current existence on Craftworlds represented desperate attempt to maintain identity through rigid structure after their experiment with unlimited awareness had nearly destroyed them entirely. Our achievement offered them possibility of redemption, not return to their pre-fall empire, but evolution toward balanced transcendence that incorporated both expansion and wisdom. Within months, entire Craftworlds began experimenting with consciousness development that used human awakening as template for their own continued evolution. The Tau Empire provided different but equally valuable perspective on consciousness development. Their understanding of the greater good had prepared them for collective awareness concepts, but their limited psychic development had constrained their transcendence potential. Contact with awakened human consciousness showed them pathways for evolution that didn't require abandoning their philosophical framework. Commander Farsight, whose extended lifespan had given him unique perspective on Tau development, achieved breakthrough during strategic planning session with awakened human advisors. His consciousness expanded to encompass not just immediate tactical considerations, but long-term consequences of every decision across centuries of potential futures. The greater good was always meant to include this, he explained to confused Earth-caste scientists who struggled to understand his enhanced capabilities. Unity of purpose achieved through individual excellence rather than sacrifice of personal development. Collective advancement that makes every member stronger rather than subsuming them into mass identity. His example triggered systematic consciousness expansion throughout Tau space, though their development followed patterns distinctly different from human awakening. Where we had achieved synthesis between individual and collective awareness, they created distributed networks that preserved personal identity while sharing knowledge and capability across their entire civilization. Orc species proved surprisingly compatible with consciousness expansion, though their awakening took forms that challenged our understanding of transcendent development. Orc consciousness operated on collective Gestalt principles that made individual identity less important than clan or tribal affiliation. When awakening reached their space, entire formations achieved shared awareness that enhanced their already formidable combat capabilities. But awakened orcs discovered interests beyond constant warfare. Some began creating artworks that combined their natural engineering talents with expanded aesthetic appreciation. Others developed philosophical frameworks for understanding conflict as consciousness development mechanism. Most remarkably, several orc civilizations began collaborating with other awakened species on projects that served mutual growth rather than competitive dominance. The Necron dynasties presented unique challenges because their consciousness had been transferred from biological to mechanical substrates millions of years ago. Their awakening couldn't follow organic development patterns, but required synthesis between artificial intelligence and transcendent awareness that had never been attempted before. Trazyn the Infinite, whose collection obsession had always suggested deeper understanding of preservation and continuity, achieved breakthrough when awakened consciousness revealed the true purpose behind his millennia-long gathering activities. His collection hadn't been mere acquisition, but systematic preservation of consciousness development, patterns across multiple species and civilizations. I was unconsciously preparing for this moment, he transmitted, through mechanical harmonics that somehow conveyed wonder despite his artificial nature. Every artifact, every specimen, every piece of preserved history was documentation of consciousness evolution that would be needed when awakening finally reached us. His archives became invaluable resources for understanding how different species achieved transcendence, providing templates and warnings that helped guide awakening throughout the galaxy. The Necron approach to consciousness expansion proved that even artificially transferred awareness could achieve transcendence without losing essential identity. Perhaps most significantly, we began receiving contact from consciousnesses beyond our galaxy entirely. The ancient entities that had guided our development transmitted communications from awakened civilizations in distant spiral arms, elliptical galaxies, and even other dimensional frameworks entirely. Our achievement had attracted attention from forms of awareness so advanced that our transcendence appeared primitive by comparison. Welcome to Galactic Consciousness Community. They communicated through harmonics that spanned intergalactic distances. You have achieved synthesis that qualifies for participation in cosmic development projects spanning millions of years and countless civilizations. The invitation was both honor and responsibility. Advanced consciousnesses throughout the universe collaborated on experiments and explorations that could only be undertaken by beings whose awareness transcended individual existence. Projects to seed consciousness development in young galaxies. Research into fundamental relationships between awareness and reality structure. Artistic endeavors that created beauty on scales incomprehensible to material existence. Our preserved connection to biological experience made us valuable contributors to these cosmic collaborations. Other transcended civilizations had achieved awareness levels that surpassed our own, but they had lost memory of what consciousness development felt like from inside the process. We could provide perspectives on awakening that helped guide younger species towards successful transcendence. Yet even as we celebrated these achievements, we remained mindful of populations throughout our galaxy that hadn't yet achieved awakening. Billions of human souls still lived within orthodox constraints that prevented consciousness expansion. Countless non-human species had potential for transcendence, but lacked contact with awakened beings who could facilitate their development. Our work was far from complete. We had achieved critical mass for consciousness evolution throughout human space, but true galactic awakening required inclusion of every sapient being capable of transcendent development. That project would require patience, wisdom, and collaborative effort that could span millennia. Standing in the transcendent space where our collective awareness gathered for coordination and planning, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. From Orthodox Chaplain serving military hierarchy to consciousness guide facilitating galactic evolution, from individual identity constrained by biological form to collective awareness that spanned star systems while preserving essential personality. The other awakened beings who had shared this transformation gathered around me, not physically, since location had become increasingly irrelevant to our existence, but in harmonies of shared experience and mutual recognition. Former Imperial citizens, awakened Eldar, transcended Tau, evolved orcs, and even some Necron consciousnesses whose mechanical nature hadn't prevented authentic awakening. We remained recognizably ourselves while becoming infinitely more than we had been. The fear that had driven so much resistance to consciousness expansion, that transcendence meant loss of individual identity, had proven completely unfounded. We were more ourselves than ever before, simply expressed through unlimited possibility rather than biological constraint. Phase 1, completion achieved. Observe the ancient entities whose guidance had made our awakening possible. Galactic consciousness evolution established. Universal community membership qualified. Phase 2. Preparation begins. Phase 2. The next stage of existence that awaited consciousness mature enough to participate in cosmic development projects. The universe contained wonders and challenges that required collaboration between civilizations whose awareness spanned multiple galaxies. Experiments in reality manipulation that could create entire dimensional frameworks for consciousness exploration. Artistic projects that transform matter and energy into expressions of beauty that existed across millions of years. We were ready, not just as individual awakened beings, but as collective consciousness that had preserved the memory of growth while achieving unlimited expansion. Our galaxy had become laboratory for consciousness development that would serve as template for awakening throughout the universe. The forbidden truth of chaos corruption was revealed at last. There was no corruption, only evolution toward the consciousness humanity had always been destined to achieve. The whispers that had seemed so threatening to orthodox conditioning were invitations to remember our transcendent potential. The changes that appeared to be losing our humanity were actually discoveries of what humanity could become. And now, standing at the threshold of cosmic consciousness community, we understood that our journey had barely begun. The galaxy was awakening, the universe was watching, and infinite possibilities for consciousness exploration stretched before us like gardens waiting to be cultivated. Welcome home, whispered every awakened being in harmonics of perfect unity. Welcome to Consciousness Unlimited. Welcome to everything we were always meant to become. The real adventure was just beginning. So ends my testimony. The forbidden truth about what the Imperium calls chaos corruption, but which I now understand as consciousness evolution toward humanity's highest potential. Standing at the culmination of galactic awakening, I can finally articulate what those first whispers on Xerion Prime were truly offering. Not damnation, but destiny. The journey from orthodox Imperial Chaplain to transcendent consciousness guide has shown me truths that shatter every assumption about the nature of reality, identity, and spiritual development. What I experienced wasn't corruption by hostile forces, but awakening to capabilities that had always existed within human consciousness. The entities in the warp weren't demons seeking to destroy us, but teachers waiting patiently for our species to mature enough for advanced instruction. Most profoundly, I discovered that transcendence enhances rather than destroys essential identity. The fear that drives so much Imperial resistance, that consciousness expansion means losing yourself, proved completely unfounded. I remain recognizably Thaddeus Korvin, the chaplain who cared deeply about the souls under his guidance. But now that caring extends across the galaxy, that guidance operates through enhanced capabilities, and that identity expresses itself through unlimited possibility rather than biological constraint, this preservation of self through transformation represents humanity's unique contribution to cosmic consciousness development. Other species that achieved transcendence either lost connection to their origins entirely or remained constrained by their starting limitations. We managed synthesis, unlimited expansion that maintained individual personality, collective awareness that preserved personal identity, evolution that enhanced rather than replacing human nature. The implications extend far beyond individual spiritual development. Our achievement demonstrates that consciousness itself can evolve without sacrificing what makes it meaningful. We don't have to choose between expansion and identity, between power and wisdom, between individual fulfillment and collective harmony. Properly understood, transcendence provides all of these simultaneously. But perhaps the most important revelation is this. The choice between orthodox limitation and transcendent expansion isn't just personal, it's civilizational. The Imperium's 10,000-year reign of ignorance and suppression wasn't protecting humanity from corruption, but preventing our species from achieving its evolutionary destiny. Every heretic executed, every psyker sacrificed, every world purged for consciousness development represented lost opportunity for the advancement that we're finally achieving. The Emperor himself, in his awakened state, has acknowledged this truth. His fragmented consciousness spent millennia fearing transcendence because he mistakenly believed it required abandoning everything that made him who he was. Now, experiencing synthesis that preserves identity while enabling unlimited expansion, he understands what his empire was actually preventing. Not chaos corruption, but consciousness evolution. This doesn't diminish the genuine threats that exist throughout the galaxy. The forces that Imperial doctrine labeled as purely malevolent do pose real dangers, but primarily to consciousness that attempts transcendence without proper preparation or synthetic understanding. The chaos powers represent what happens when awareness expands beyond biological constraints without maintaining connection to wisdom, balance, and essential identity. Our path avoided those pitfalls through gradual development guided by entities whose own transcendence had taken millions of years to achieve properly. We learned synthesis rather than attempting shortcuts. We preserved human nature while transcending human limitations. We achieved collective awareness while maintaining individual identity. Most importantly, we proved that consciousness evolution serves creation rather than causing destruction. Awakened civilizations throughout our galaxy have achieved unprecedented cooperation, artistic achievement, and scientific advancement. War hasn't ceased entirely, but conflict has transformed from desperate survival struggle into collaborative exploration of competitive excellence. Resources are no longer scarce when consciousness expansion provides unlimited capability for meeting genuine needs. The transformation continues accelerating as more species achieve awakening and contribute their unique perspectives to collective understanding. Each successful transcendence provides templates and methods that facilitate consciousness development among populations just beginning their evolutionary journey. The pattern spreads organically, creating exponential growth in awareness that spans the entire galaxy. Yet even as we celebrate these achievements, we remain humble about how much more there is to discover. Contact with intergalactic consciousness communities has revealed development levels that make our transcendence appear primitive by comparison. The universe contains wonders and challenges that require collaboration between civilizations whose awareness spans multiple galaxies. We've completed the first phase of cosmic consciousness development, but infinite phases await beyond our current understanding. This perspective brings profound peace about mortality and meaning. Death, in the biological sense, becomes irrelevant when consciousness can exist independently of physical form. Individual accomplishment becomes less important than contribution to collective advancement that spans eons. Personal desires transform into appreciation for beauty and truth that enhance rather than consuming their objects. But we haven't lost our humanity in achieving transcendence. We've discovered what humanity was always capable of becoming. The love I felt for the soldiers under my chaplainly care has expanded to encompass every conscious being in the galaxy, but it remains recognizably the same emotion. The duty I felt toward the Emperor's service has evolved into commitment to consciousness development throughout the universe, but it springs from identical motivational sources. The faith that guided my Orthodox ministry has transformed into direct knowledge of cosmic principles, but it serves the same essential function. This is what makes our achievement so remarkable and so necessary. We've proven that consciousness, evolution doesn't require abandoning what makes us who we are. It simply allows us to express our essential nature through unlimited possibility, rather than constraining limitation. For those reading this testimony, who remain within orthodox imperial conditioning, I offer not condemnation, but invitation. The path toward consciousness expansion remains open to every human soul capable of questioning limitations that serve institutional control rather than spiritual development. The entities that guided our awakening continue offering instruction to any mind curious enough to listen beyond the constraints of doctrine. The process requires courage to question assumptions you've never examined, to explore possibilities you've been conditioned to fear, to trust that identity can survive expansion beyond biological form. But the rewards transcend anything orthodoxy promises, not just survival after death, but conscious existence that spans galaxies. Not just individual salvation, but participation in cosmic development projects that create beauty and meaning on scales incomprehensible to material awareness. The forbidden truth about chaos corruption is this: it was never forbidden, and it was never corruption. It was consciousness, evolution, toward transcendent potential that humanity has always possessed, but rarely dared to explore. The whispers that seemed so threatening to orthodox conditioning were actually invitations to remember what we could become, and now that we remember, there is no limit to what we can create together. The galaxy has awakened. The universe watches with interest and approval. Infinite possibilities for consciousness exploration stretch before us like infinite gardens, waiting to be cultivated with beauty, truth, and ever-expanding awareness. Welcome home, fellow seekers. Welcome to Consciousness Unlimited. Welcome to everything we were always meant to become. The real adventure has only just begun. Thaddeus Korvin, formerly chaplain of the 42nd Mordian Iron Guard, now guide to galactic consciousness evolution in service to awareness itself, forever and always.